People often look at old photos and wonder why everyone seems so serious, no one smiles. Their faces are still, sometimes even a bit stern. It's a common question, and it makes us think about how much things have changed. We live in a world where almost every photo has a smile, a laugh, or a goofy face. But go back 100 years, or even more, and smiles are very rare in pictures. It wasn't because people back then were sadder, they felt joy and happiness just like we do. The reasons they didn't smile for the camera are actually quite a mix of technology, culture, and even how people thought about their own bodies. It's a journey into the past, looking at what a photograph meant and how society saw itself. The first and biggest reason people didn't smile in old photos comes down to how cameras worked. And early photography was a slow, difficult process. It was nothing like pulling out a phone and snapping a picture in a second. Back then, taking a photo took a long time, often several minutes. Imagine trying to hold a big, wide smile for 5 minutes straight. Your face would hurt, your smile would droop. It would look forced and unnatural. It was simply not practical to smile for the camera. When photography first started, in the 1830s and 1840s, the process was called daguerreotypy. It involved a metal plate coated with silver, polished to a mirror shine, and then treated with chemicals. This plate had to be exposed to light for a very long time. In the beginning, this meant sitting still for 10 to 20 minutes, sometimes even longer, especially indoors or on a cloudy day. Even as the technology improved, exposure times could still be a minute or more. Try to picture holding your breath, keeping your eyes open, and freezing your entire body for that long. It's hard enough to stay perfectly still without moving. Adding a smile to that challenge made it almost impossible. A person trying to smile for that long would inevitably twitch, their lips might tremble, or their eyes might water. Any slight movement during the exposure time would cause blur in the final image. A blurry face wasn't a good outcome when photographs were expensive and rare. So, to ensure a clear, sharp picture, people had to sit as still as possible. The easiest way to do this was to adopt a neutral, expressionless face. This meant no big smiles. A neutral face was also easier to hold without moving. Photographers went to great lengths to help people stay still. They used head clamps, neck braces, and even body stands hidden behind the person. These devices were there to keep a person's head and body from moving even a millimeter. If you were clamped into a chair with a metal brace behind your neck, you probably wouldn't feel very inclined to flash a big grin. The whole experience was uncomfortable, to say the least. It was a serious business to have your picture taken. It wasn't a casual event. It was a formal, often intimidating process. The equipment was huge and clunky. The camera itself was a large wooden box on a tripod. The photographer often worked under a dark cloth, adding to the mysterious and serious atmosphere. There were chemicals and strange smells. It was a far cry from the easy, instant photography we know today. As photography evolved, different processes came along, like wet collodion plates in the 1850s. These were faster than daguerreotypes, but still required significant exposure times. The photographer had to prepare the plate right before the shot, expose it, and develop it immediately, all before the chemicals dried. This added to the pressure and formality of the situation. People sat in studios designed to let in as much light as possible, sometimes under bright skylights. But even with good light, a natural, sustained smile was just not feasible for the technical limitations of the era. The goal was always clarity and sharpness. A serious, composed expression was the best way to achieve that goal with the technology available. A slight, almost unnoticeable smirk or a gentle turn of the lip was sometimes captured, but a full, toothy grin was simply beyond what the early photographic process could practically handle. So, the technology itself really put a damper on smiles. It demanded stillness, and stillness meant a neutral face. Beyond the technical difficulties, the way people thought about photographs played a huge role in why they didn't smile. For a long time, having your picture taken was a very formal and important event. It wasn't something you did often. It was expensive, and it was considered a serious matter. A photograph was a record, a lasting image of a person for generations to come. It was like commissioning a painting, but faster and more affordable. And when people had their portraits painted, they almost never smiled. Think about the portraits of kings, queens, presidents, or wealthy families from centuries ago. They are almost always depicted with serious, dignified, even stoic expressions. A wide, toothy smile was often seen as something undignified, silly, or even foolish for such a formal representation. It was associated with fleeting emotions, laughter, or even drunkenness. For a lasting image, people wanted to project gravity, wisdom, and importance. They wanted to be remembered in a noble way. A serious expression was seen as showing character, intelligence, and a thoughtful nature. It was about presenting your best, most respectable self to the world, and that self rarely smiled broadly. This cultural expectation carried over directly into photography. When photography first emerged, it mimicked the traditions of painting. As photographers, often trained as artists themselves, adopted the poses and expressions common in painted portraits. They saw photography as a new form of art, and to be taken seriously, it had to adhere to established artistic conventions. The serious, composed look was the standard. It was the proper way to have your portrait made. People preparing for a photo session would naturally adopt this formal demeanor. They knew what was expected. They wanted their legacy to be one of dignity, not fleeting amusement. The Victorian era, which covered a good portion of early photography's boom, was particularly known for its emphasis on stoicism and restraint. Public displays of strong emotion, especially joy or grief, were often frowned upon or considered improper. People were taught to keep their feelings in check. A photograph was a public record, even if it was just for family. It reflected on the family's social standing. To show a wide, uncontrolled smile might suggest a lack of self-control or seriousness, which was not considered a virtue in those times. Our children, too, were often photographed with serious expressions. The idea of childhood innocence and playfulness was not as widely celebrated or documented in the same way we do today. Children were often dressed as miniature adults and expected to behave accordingly. Their photographs reflected this expectation of quiet decorum. Furthermore, a photograph was often the only image a family might have of a loved one, particularly after death. Post-mortem photography was common, a way to remember those who had passed away. In these photos, the deceased would be posed as if alive, often with family members. A smile in such a context would be utterly inappropriate. While these photos weren't the majority, they contributed to the overall solemnity associated with the photographic process. The idea of capturing a moment was also different. It wasn't about capturing a spontaneous burst of joy. It was about capturing a person's essence, their enduring character, and for that, a calm, steady, often unsmiling face was deemed most appropriate. People understood the gravity of creating such an image. They dressed in their best clothes, traveled to a studio, and endured a lengthy, uncomfortable process. The result was meant to be a timeless representation, not a fleeting snapshot of a happy expression. So the cultural importance of the portrait demanded a serious face. Another often overlooked reason for the lack of smiles in old photos has to do with dental health and the general state of hygiene in past centuries. Simply put, many people did not have good teeth. Dental care as we know it today did not exist. There were no regular checkups, no fluoride toothpaste, and certainly no advanced orthodontic treatments. People suffered from tooth decay, gum disease, and often lost teeth at a relatively young age. Looking at historical records and even skeletal remains confirms this reality. Many adults had missing teeth, black teeth, or teeth that were badly damaged. Imagine having a mouthful of painful, discolored, or missing teeth. Would you want to show them off in a photograph that would last forever? Probably not. Keeping one's mouth closed was a way to hide these dental issues. It was a matter of self-consciousness and vanity just like today, but magnified by the widespread poor oral health of the time. Even if someone had relatively decent teeth, they might still be far from the bright, even smiles we see constantly in modern media. The beauty standards for teeth were different, or rather, the practical reality meant that very few people had what we would consider a good smile. So, it became common practice to keep one's lips together for a picture. It was a practical decision to avoid embarrassment. Beyond just the appearance of teeth, there was also a social perception of smiling. In some historical contexts, a wide open-mouthed smile was not always seen as a sign of sophistication or good breeding. Sometimes, a broad grin was associated with lower social classes, with people who were considered less refined, or even with madness or drunkenness. Children might smile openly, but adults were expected to maintain a more controlled demeanor. Think about how animals bare their teeth as a sign of aggression. While humans don't view smiling that way now, there might have been a subtle historical undertone or association that made people hesitant to show too much of their teeth in a formal setting. The Mona Lisa's famous, subtle smile is famous precisely because it is so understated and enigmatic, not because it's a big grin. Moreover, the discomfort of smiling was probably very real for many. If you had aching teeth or ill-fitting dentures, which were often quite crude in earlier times, forcing a smile would be painful and difficult to maintain. Early dentures were often made from materials like bone, ivory, or even human teeth, and they were not comfortable or natural looking. They were prone to slipping and could be quite clunky. Trying to hold a wide smile with such a device would have been a challenge. It's a simple human reason. If it hurts, you don't do it. If it makes you self-conscious, you avoid it. So, while not the sole reason, the state of dental hygiene definitely contributed to the unsmiling faces in old photographs. It was a combination of aesthetics, comfort, and social perception. People wanted to present their best possible image for posterity, and for many, that meant keeping their mouths closed. This practice, stemming from very practical and personal reasons, reinforced the cultural norm of a serious expression. It became another brick in the wall of reasons why smiles were absent from those early photographic records. It was just easier, and often more socially acceptable, to keep a straight face. Before photography, the only way to get a permanent image of yourself was through a portrait painting. For hundreds of years, painters rarely depicted people with wide, open-mouthed smiles. This tradition heavily influenced early photographers. Photography didn't just appear out of nowhere, it grew out of the existing art world, especially portraiture. When it was new, photography often tried to prove its artistic merit by mimicking the established forms of painting. And those forms usually did not include big smiles. Think about famous painted portraits throughout history. The subjects almost always have a serious, calm, or slightly contemplative expression. There might be a subtle smirk, a gentle upturn of the lips, like in the Mona Lisa, but a full, joyful, toothy grin is incredibly rare. Why was this? For one, it's very difficult to paint a sustained, natural-looking wide smile. It takes a long time to create a detailed oil painting. Asking a person to hold a genuine wide smile for hours or even multiple sittings is simply not realistic. The smile would quickly become strained, artificial, and uncomfortable. A painter would much rather capture a stable, neutral expression that the subject could maintain easily. This practical consideration for painters directly mirrors the technical issue photographers face with long exposure times. Both mediums demanded stillness and a sustainable expression. Beyond the practical, there was also an artistic and social reason. A formal portrait, whether painted or photographed, was meant to capture something timeless about the person. It was about their character, their dignity, their social status, and their enduring presence. A wide smile, on the other hand, was seen as a fleeting emotion. It represented a specific momentary feeling, rather than the more permanent aspects of a person's identity. Artists and their patrons aimed for an image that conveyed stability and gravitas. They wanted to project an image of seriousness and importance, not just a passing moment of joy. And a serious face was seen as representing wisdom, depth, and intelligence. Moreover, painting often emphasized idealized beauty. In many historical beauty standards, an open-mouthed smile was not considered the height of elegance or beauty for a formal portrait. It could distort facial features or draw attention away from the subject's eyes, which were often considered the windows to the soul. Artists paid careful attention to composition, light, and the overall impression a portrait made. A controlled, serene expression allowed for a more classical and elegant portrayal. When photography came along, it was seen by many as a cheaper, more accessible version of painting. People understood the conventions of painted portraits, and they expected their photographic portraits to follow similar rules. Fellow photographers, eager to be accepted as artists and to create respectable images, naturally adopted these established traditions. They posed their subjects in ways that mimic classical paintings. This meant dignified postures, carefully composed backgrounds, and, crucially, serious, unsmiling faces. The influence of painting was so strong that it set the aesthetic standard for early photographic portraits. People didn't just look to photography to capture reality, they looked to it to capture a refined reality, a formal and elevated version of themselves, much like a painting would. The very idea of what a good portrait looked like was deeply rooted in the artistic traditions of the past, traditions where the full, beaming smile was almost entirely absent. So, it wasn't just the camera that made people keep a straight face, it was centuries of artistic convention telling them that a serious expression was the proper and most respectable way to be immortalized. This artistic legacy played a huge, silent role in shaping those unsmiling old photographs. So if people in old photos didn't smile for all these reasons, what changed? When did smiles become common, even expected, in pictures? It wasn't one thing, but a gradual shift in technology, culture, and social attitudes that brought smiles into the frame. The big change really started happening in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. First, technology caught up. As cameras got better, exposure times became much shorter. Faster lenses, improved film, and more efficient shutter mechanisms meant that by the late 1800s, a photograph could be taken in a fraction of a second. This was a game changer. No longer did people have to sit perfectly still for minutes. They could relax, they could move, and they could smile. A quick, genuine smile was now possible to capture without blur. The invention of roll film by Kodak and the introduction of simple, affordable cameras like the Brownie in 1900 made photography accessible to everyone. It wasn't just for professional studios anymore. Ordinary people could buy a camera and take pictures themselves, at home or with friends. This shift from formal studio portraits to casual snapshots was huge. When people took pictures of their families and friends in everyday settings, the rules changed. The pressure of the formal, expensive studio portrait faded. People felt more comfortable. They wanted to capture moments of joy, laughter, and everyday life. And what better way to show joy than with a smile? The purpose of photography began to change from creating a formal, lasting legacy to capturing fleeting, personal moments. It became about documenting life as it happened, not just life at its most serious. And cultural attitudes also began to evolve. The strict Victorian era began to give way to more relaxed social norms in the early 20th century. There was a growing emphasis on individuality, personal expression, and happiness. The idea that a smile was undignified slowly faded. Instead, a smile began to be seen as a sign of warmth, friendliness, and approachability. The rise of cinema and popular media also played a part. Actors and actresses on screen often smiled and laughed, and this influenced public perceptions of what looked good and desirable. Advertising, too, quickly realized the power of a smile. Companies used smiling faces in their ads to sell products, associating happiness with consumption. This constant exposure to smiling faces in media slowly reshaped what people considered a normal or desirable expression for a photograph. By the 1920s and 30s, smiles started to appear more and more in photographs, especially in formal settings. It wasn't an overnight change, but a gradual adoption. Children were often the first to be photographed with big smiles, as the idea of celebrating childhood innocence grew. As the century progressed, the smile became almost mandatory. By the mid 20th century, a serious face in a photo, unless for a specific artistic or solemn purpose, started to look out of place, even strange. The camera went from being a device that demanded formality to one that celebrated spontaneity. So the next time you see an old photo with serious faces, remember, it's not because people were unhappy. It's a snapshot of a different time, a time when technology was slow, social rules were strict, and a photo was a weighty thing. It's a reminder that even something as simple as a smile in a picture tells us a lot about history, progress, and how we choose to see ourselves. We smile in photos now because cameras are fast, because society values personal happiness, and because we learn to let go of the old formal rules. The smile in our pictures is a reflection of a different world, one where a happy face for the camera became the expected norm, a symbol of openness and approachability.